This lecture will be done in several parts. For today, we're going to look at first the general reasons for imperialism and techniques of imperialism. Then we're going to look at South Asia. What we see on this opening slide is we see a political cartoon that kind of symbolizes imperialism. It shows people, native people from around the world, whether they be India or Africa or Southeast Asia, and they're carrying imperialist countries on their back. We see the United States in the foreground, and then Johnny Bull, England is second, and then perhaps Germany, and so forth and so on. And at the bottom it says white man's burden, and we'll talk about what that means on an upcoming slide. So let's start with causes of imperialism. Why would Western countries, primarily Western countries, imperialist countries are going to be countries from Western Europe like the UK, Germany, France. It's going to be countries like the United States, and then finally Japan. Those are your major imperialist countries at this time. Why are they going to want to spend incredible amounts of money and time and effort going out and conquering new colonies? Well, the reason a lot of people do many things is economic. As the industrialization had started in the countries I just mentioned, they're going to need access to a whole bunch of raw materials that they either can't get in their home country or they don't have in enough quantities. And so they're going to need to go get raw materials that they can then bring back to their home country, use it in the industrial process in some way, make it into a finished good, use it to make other things into finished goods, and then they're going to need to go then sell those goods. And so industrialization really is heavily linked to imperialism. We need raw materials, whether it's gold from South Africa, rubber from Southeast Asia, coal from Manchuria. We need to bring those raw materials back to our industrialized countries for our manufacturing processes. Once we've made it into something, then we need to force people to buy it. There's going to be, in the United States and Western Europe and Japan, there's going to be several economic downturns during industrialization where capitalists got really good at making things, but they got so good at making things that they outproduced their own home country's ability to consume. We're just making stuff by the boatload, by the trainload, making, but then we saturated our market. There just wasn't enough customers in our home country to continue to consume, to support all of these factories that are opening up. And so if we go get a colony, then we can not only force these people in these countries around the world to gather raw materials for us at a cheap price, but then we can go ahead, make it into something, and then force these colonies to buy it back from us at a high price, creating even more markets, more profit for our industrialized countries. Now, if I'm a business and I'm going to go open up a coal mine in Manchuria or a diamond or gold mine in South Africa or a rubber plantation in Southeast Asia, I'm going to invest a lot of money in these far-off places. And I want to make sure that my investments are protected, that there's not some uprising among poor people or a dictator someplace far away or some native ruler is going to rise up and take all my investments away, my coal mine away, my plantation away. And so in these industrialized countries, the private companies are going to fully expect and get their governments to go right along with them and provide military protection for their investments. And this hand in hand of the government and the military and private businesses going out and getting raw materials and getting markets, when all of that is coming together, business, capitalists, the military, that really is what imperialism is. All efforts made by the more developed country to oppress the conquered country and make as much profit as possible off of them. So those are economic reasons. Let's now switch to political reasons for imperialism. So one of them is nationalism, right? We've talked about nationalism. It's this idea that your ethnic group, your people, your country is the best country in the world. You should be celebrated. And so this lends itself to a competition kind of idea. If, as we see in this picture, France is going out and carving up parts of the globe and getting colonies, well, then England is also going to want to take a slice of the globe. You know, who are the French to go get the world and not the English? And then the Germans get involved. And so we see that this idea of competition that is created by nationalism. My country's the best, my people are the best, so we should not fall behind. We should go have more of the globe than any of our rivals. This is going to be fueling or pushing countries to go and get colonies. So we talked about nationalism. Here we see a pretty famous cartoon, and it's really kind of a warning to other countries. This was viewed in the United States, and we see England going out and through her military and her industries, getting India and Egypt and Canada and Jamaica and Malta and all of these different things, and he's bringing it all back to him. And so from an American's viewpoint, how dare we let the English go do this? America's the best. We should go get colonies before England gets them all. And so this race to compete is going to really speed up the pace of imperialism, force countries to go get more so they can keep up with their rivals. Let's go to military. And so another reason for imperialism is that as we're going around the globe, gobbling up, slicing off pieces of the globe, we're going to need refueling stations. At this time, we have made the switch from sailing ships to coal-powered steamships, and you need places around the globe for your shipping, your private shipping, or your military, your navy, to have deposits of stockpiles of coal built up and safe harbors where you can kind of conduct your naval operations from. Because the world is a big place, the oceans are big, and so you can't just put enough coal in your ship to get it all the way around the world. You need to have refueling stations. And so that's another reason for us to go get colonies or ports or parts of the world, because it'll allow our private businesses to go and refuel on their way to and from the colonies. And it'll also allow the military bases to refuel and have safe harbors where they can protect our merchant navy, our private businesses. Another thing we're going to see is there's this idea of choke points of trade. There are going to be certain points in the globe, just because of geography, where it's really important to have that part of the world. So if we see in the bottom right-hand corner the Straits of Malacca, you see all of these islands in Indonesia, and if you were going from India to China, right at the very tip of Southeast Asia, you see the Malay Peninsula, and it's kind of just straight up from the H in Straits of Malacca. And that little narrow point where you can go between two islands, that's where modern-day Singapore is today, and that's called the Straits of Malacca. And if you controlled that port, you could control all the naval traffic, the maritime traffic between South Asia and East Asia. And so we're going to see countries grab for that, right? They're going to need to go get that colony. Because if we control that choke point of trade, we could tax or deny our rivals going in and out of there in their trade route. Another two choke points that we're going to see is that these are two canals that are going to be built that we've talked about. The Sinai Peninsula is going to have the Suez Canal, and that is going to be a choke point of trade, because if you want to go from Europe to Asia by water, the quickest way to do that is to go through the Mediterranean and then go through the canal that separates Asia from Africa, and that's a much shorter journey than going all the way around Africa to get from Europe to Asia. And so the Brits are going to own that, and it's very important for them to hold that. Now on the Western Hemisphere, we've talked about the building of the Panama Canal, and so the Panama Canal is going to be built just in the next time period, in period 4. It's going to be built in the early 1900s, but that's another example of this kind of world trade choke point. The United States, if they want to get goods or raw materials or finished products from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States, the quickest way to do that, instead of going all the way around the tip of South America and then back up, is to have where you see it's very thin there in Central America, Panama, to build a canal there, and then it's much shorter trip to go from east to west. And so these are examples of choke points of trade. Another thing pushing modernized, industrialized countries to go grab parts of the globe for themselves. Let's finish up causes, and let's talk about cultural reasons for imperialism. And so we have this concept of social Darwinism. So in the mid-19th century, in the mid-1800s, Charles Darwin the scientist is gonna, the naturalist, he is going to come up with his theory of evolution, right? Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. And he uses that to explain how animals evolve and how one species succeeds while another one dies out. Well, as we get to the end of the 19th century, the 1800s, we're going to see that people, primarily white people from Western Europe and the United States, are going to use that ideology of competition, survival of the fittest, from the animal world, and they're going to apply it to the human world. And it's going to get all wrapped up with nationalism. And so here we're going to say, look, white people have... They have not just the ability, but they're supposed to be, they're scientifically, quote unquote, superior to other people. You know, if we look around the globe in the 19th century, we see European countries and the United States conquering. And well, what's the reason for that? Why are these white, quote unquote, nations conquering the globe? And we just apply the theory of evolution. We're like, well, it's because we must be superior. We must have some kind of mental or physical superior DNA makeup. Maybe our culture is superior, and that allows us to go and conquer people who are inferior. And it's just, you know, Darwinism, evolution here in the human world. And so this is used as an excuse to go and conquer and subjugate and tyrannize and oppress other people. And so this is a factor playing into it. Now, of course, throughout most of human history, it's not Europe and the West that's been the dominant force in the world, but we're going to forget that because we're not studying world history at this point. We're just using this as an excuse to demonstrate that we should be superior. And so they tried to measure this, right? And so we see this picture of this white person in the foreground, and he's got this shaped nose, and his eyes are a certain way, and his cheekbones and hair and whatever. And so then we, you know, this, according to this theory, the further away you go from typical Caucasian features, the less advanced people are. So it's okay to go conquer them. And we actually have a duty to conquer them to, you know, to make sure that the dominant race survives and conquers. Now, when we get to period 4, when we talk about the 20th century, of course, this social Darwinism is going to be picked up on by fascists and Nazis in the 1930s and 40s to justify the Holocaust and Nazism, and that just didn't come out of nowhere. This has been something that we see evolving in the 19th century. Here we see another interesting example of this idea, right? So we see in the top picture people who are darker skinned, they're using simple tools to go hunt and get their food. And then we see, well, you know, white people from the West have evolved even more, and so they're able to now hunt the hunters. And it's a very, you know, disturbing image, but it seems to justify that it's okay because just like in the top image, it was okay for more evolved species to hunt less evolved species. Now in the bottom picture, the same rule applies for more evolved species to go and kill less evolved species. So it's a very disturbing way of looking at the world at this time, but it was something that was used to justify imperialism and conquest. Along with that, we get this concept of white man's burden. And so white man's burden is very similar in many ways to the concept of social Darwinism, except it's supposed to be maybe a little bit less violent. It's supposed to be for more altruistic reasons we should conquer. Social Darwinism just says go out and conquer because you're superior. White man's burden says, yes, we should go out and conquer, and we are superior, but we're going to do it to help the conquered people. We are going to, you know, so we see this very racist picture of this American soldier taking this African, and, you know, we are going to capture them and we are going to, you know, bring them to education. So we see the schoolhouse up above. We're going to bring them to modern medicine. We're going to bring them to, quote unquote, civilization because we are superior to them. And while social Darwinism says just look, go and kill and conquer, the white man's burden says, yes, you can go and conquer, but it's for an altruistic reason. We're going to go conquer to help the people that we've conquered. And they may not want us to do it, but we're going to do it anyway, because aren't we great? We're going to bring them civilization. That's our burden, that we have to go help people who may not want to be helped, but who need to be helped. And so this is going to be something that is definitely used by missionaries at the time. We need to bring them to the right religion, Christianity. We need to bring them to the right way of thinking in the Enlightenment. We need to bring them to modern education and science, and all the other traditional cultures in the region, well, that's just not very advanced. And so it's our burden to do that. So here we see some cultural justifications for going out and conquering. Now, we'll switch gears and talk about Section B. Just because you want to conquer, we've talked about the economic, political, cultural reasons for it. It doesn't mean you get to conquer. And in the past, we've talked about how Europe, in the Age of Exploration, in period 2 for AP, they did go out and conquer some regions, but couldn't conquer other regions. The Europeans were able to conquer the Americas, but they couldn't conquer Africa for various reasons in that time period, and they couldn't conquer South Asia, and they couldn't conquer East Asia, because there were just too many people in South and East Asia and not enough Europeans to go and conquer it. But in this time period, in period 3, from 1750 to 1900, Europe has gone through industrialization. They have started to mass produce weapons. They have started to use the scientific revolution to come up with new and better weapons, new and better ways of killing people, more efficient ways of killing people, because that's really industrialization, right? Invent tools that are more efficient in whatever you want to do. And so since we now have things like repeating rifles, better artillery, better sailing ships, and of course machine guns, we now have the tools to overcome our lack of population in the Western world. Now we can go to India or China and conquer them. Even though they have more people, well, we can just have this two-man crew operate this machine gun, and these two guys can kill 100 people in just minutes. And so that seems to equalize the number in balance. And so now we see that imperialism is going to be able to happen because we have this new military technology. We had talked about new and better artillery that's going to allow that to happen. Iron ships. These ships are going, when we sail into Japan's harbor or China's harbor, they have wooden vessels. We have ships made of iron and metal, and so we're going to be able to win battles. We have all of these technological advances and advantages because we've industrialized, and they really haven't. So that's the military side. Let's now talk about non-military technology that allows us to conquer. We had said ships allows us to conquer because we have battleships, but that doesn't just have to deal with the military. We're going to see that ships are going to be using steam engines, and they're going to be using paddle wheels, and they're going to be using screws to push the ship forward, and so we really don't need to depend on wind anymore. And so the time and that it gets from England, let's say, to India, or from the United States to the Philippines, or France to Indonesia, all of these conquering countries, the time is going to shrink that it takes to get from one place to the other. So, and in business, time is money. And so now, if you're a capitalist and you have a plantation in Southeast Asia, you can quickly go there, get the raw materials, bring them back to France, make them into something, and then send them back to Indonesia as a finished product to sell. And so this allows it to just be happening more efficiently, and efficiency means more profit. We're also going to see, once we're inside the country and conquer them, we're going to see just a huge influx of railroad building around the world. And here, it's not the countries themselves that are building the railroads. Like when we talked about the United States, we talked about Russia, we talked about England. They were building railroads to connect their raw materials and markets inside their country. But in South Asia and in East Asia and in Southeast Asia, the people in India are not going to be financing the railroad production. It's going to be outside companies from countries that have come in and conquered. And so the British government or British businesses will be building railroads in India, or the French will be building railroads in Indonesia. You get the idea, because we want to be able to get inside those countries, get the raw materials quickly and efficiently out, and then back to Europe. And then once we bring finished products in, we want to be able to get those finished goods inside of the country to sell them to as many people as possible. So it's good for business. We're also going to see the invention of the telegraph at this time. And so the telegraph is a wire that has electrical impulses that are sent back and forth on it, Morse code. And that is going to allow us to communicate, which is good for one, militarily holding on to your empire. If there's a rebellion, we can find out about it quickly and send troops. So we can hold on to our wide-ranging empire. But also, it's going to allow businessmen to communicate more efficiently around the world. And so if I'm in, Delhi, if I'm a British businessman in Delhi and I find out that people need, I don't know, more shoes, then I can quickly telegraph the home factory back in England and say, okay, make more shoes and send them here, or we've got enough shoes. And so it just makes businesses more efficient with this better communication. All right, so that's kind of the general reasons why people want to be imperialists and then how they're able to be imperialists, their motives and methods of imperialism. So now, for the first section of this lecture, let's talk about South Asia. And when we're done with South Asia, this first part of imperialism will close and we'll address the rest of imperialism in other subsequent lectures. So South Asia, also known as India, it's actually more than India today. It's going to be Bangladesh and Pakistan, but for the most part, India, this huge subcontinent attached to Asia. Right? So let's go from beginning to the end of the time period as a change over time. So at the beginning of the time period, we did have the Mughal Empire. It was a Muslim empire in South Asia controlled by South Asians. And they were the dominant force in India. And in the last time period, from 1450 to 1750, at the end of that time period, the Mughal Empire is strong and powerful, and they have their act together. They're centralized enough that they were able to keep the Europeans really just contained in the ports along the coast of India. But as we get into this time period, 1750 to 1900, we're going to see that the Mughal Empire is weakening, which is going to make it possible for foreign powers like the French, like the Portuguese, like the British, to move inland from their ports and take advantage of that weakening empire and create a land-based empire in India. Now, why is it weakening? Well, there's many reasons: corruption in the government, overtaxation, those kinds of things. But when we see the government start to break down, we're going to have people rebel inside of India, and it's the Marathas. So the Marathas are these kind of local warlords who resent far-off Mughal control. They don't like that these people who are in the capital a long ways away, the Mughals, telling them what to do in their own kingdoms. And so these Marathas, they rise up and they see that the Mughals are weakening, and so they're going to take advantage of it. So this is an internal reason for the decline of the Mughal Empire. Now, an external reason, as I said previously, as the Marathas weaken the empire and the Mughals from within, the British primarily are going to take advantage of this, and it's the British East India Tea Company before it's the British government. So the British East India Tea Company, they're a private company who are really interested in expanding their business operations in India, because India has lots of raw materials that we could use for our factories back home, and they have lots of people, so they have lots of markets that we could sell to. And so the British East India Tea Company is going to use their own private army, every so often augmented by the British government's army, and they're going to go in and they're going to start to gobble up big internal parts of India. So they're starting to create a land empire instead of just a port empire like they had last time period. Now, why are they able to do this? Well, we have said that the British, even though there's not as many British as there are, nowhere near as many British as there are of people in India, they're able to overcome this lack of numbers through modern technology. And so we're going to see the British bring in their rifles, and later on their repeating rifles, and even later on, near the end of the time period, their machine guns. And so just a handful of British soldiers are able to subjugate millions and millions of people from South Asia. So the British East India Tea Company is getting more and more and more control over the continent of South Asia. Now, why do they want to do this? Well, obviously they're a company, and the goal of any company is to make as much money as profit as possible. And so they're going to go in there and they're going to subjugate the people. They're going to force the people to work as laborers for the British East India Tea Company. They're not going to pay them very much at all. And then they're going to use that labor to bring out raw materials like opium or tea or cotton. They're going to send that back to England, turn it into something, and then force the people of India to buy it at a higher price. And when you buy low and sell high, you're going to make a lot of profit. And so India becomes what we call a dependent economy. They're not able to function on their own anymore because they depend on England to provide them jobs. They depend on England to buy their goods. They depend on England to sell them products. And so we are oppressing India, but making England more and more and more powerful and rich. And so again, so we have the same problem here, is that just like the military, there's not enough soldiers in the British East India Tea Company before to conquer all of India, but we can rectify that with machine guns. Well, how do we govern India when it has so many more people than England does? And so the British East India Tea Company, they can't send over millions of bureaucrats and civil servants to govern India because there's just not that many people back in England. And so what they do is they send over a few bureaucrats, but what they primarily do is they depend on the government that's already in place in India. We've talked about how India at times has some centralization, like the Mughal Empire, but for the most part, India has traditionally been ruled by local kings, local rulers known as Rajas. And so in this picture, we see the British India Tea Company officer on the left, and he has left the local Indian Raja in charge of the province and to do all the work for him. And he just says, look, I'm going to let you stay in charge. You can still stay wealthy, but you're going to make sure that we collect taxes from the people and make sure that the people are working for the British India Tea Company and they don't rebel. And as long as they do those things, I'll let you keep some of the profit. And so this is a cheap, easy way for a smaller group of people to rule a larger group of people. And it works for a while, right? So we have this company rule. It's sometimes called indirect rule, where you indirectly rule India through the local leaders. And we've talked about here are some of the crops, right? And so this is something that you need to know, the specific crops that are being taken out of India. Mostly tea, the British do love their tea, cotton for all those textile mills back in England, opium, we've talked about this, opium is going to be grown in India, and then the British are going to then export it to China to get the Chinese hooked on this drug, opium, and so then the Chinese will then have an insatiable demand for this drug that the British got them hooked on, and then they'll sell them their luxury goods at a very cheap price, really just to get the drugs. And so we see that the British are kind of in this worldwide trade network with the opium. The British company owns the opium plantations in India. The people in India work on the opium plantations. We sell the opium to China. China then gives us all of their silver as much as possible, and then we use that silver to buy the luxury goods from China and then bring the luxury goods back to England. And so it's this worldwide trade network. Okay, also we had talked about, so the British are indeed, you can see the railroads being built in India at this time, and it's primarily built by the British East India Company to help them get their tea and their opium and their cotton out and their finished goods in. In fact, many of the roads still in use in India today were originally built by the imperialist British. It's not because the British were trying to help India, it's because they were trying to, make money and get their goods in and out. Now, even with the British East India Company equipping their own soldiers with machine guns and repeating rifles and artillery, it's still not enough. India has a lot of people. So to help keep the peace and to help keep protests down, the British India Tea Company will hire local South Asians to augment their army. And so these are called sepoys. And so here we see they look like British soldiers. They have their classic red uniform, but they're going to be employees of the British East India Company, and they're going to be given money to help repress their own fellow citizens. And these guys, they need money. They need to be able to feed their family, and so they'll work for the tea company to go ahead and do this. And so we see that going on. Now, not only does the British East India Tea Company hire South Asians to augment their military, but they also, of course, hire them to be laborers. And so they're going to pay these South Asians very low wages, and they're going to make them work extremely long hours, and then whatever money they make, they're going to make them give it back to the company to buy finished goods. Also, we see the white man's burden in India. White Christian missionaries are going to feel it's their calling, their duty to spread their faith to India. And so we're going to see in this picture you see on the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the Caucasian woman, and she and her husband are going to go to South Asia, and they're going to try to convert people from Hinduism or Islam to Protestant Christianity. So that's another reason that Britons are interested in India and how they impact change. And now, India is going to become so profitable for the British East India Tea Company, and then by extension the British government itself, that it's going to be called the jewel in the crown. Right? England is going to have colonies all over the world at this point. In fact, this is really England's heyday as an empire. They're going to have colonies in Africa, they're going to have colonies in the Caribbean, they're going to have colonies in South Asia, they're going to have colonies in Southeast Asia, they're going to have some ports in China. And there's this famous saying that the sun never set on the British Empire, because it didn't, right? All over the globe we see British colonies, but the most important colony in all of the British Empire was India, because of its huge access to raw materials and its absolutely huge markets, all of those people that we can sell goods to. Companies' impact on people. So how did company rule impact the South Asians themselves? And so we're going to see, as I said, it's going to become a dependent economy. The people in South Asia in the past have made cotton, right? They've grown cotton and they made textiles. And there were millions of artisans in South Asia who turned that cotton grown in South Asia into textiles made in South Asia. But the British do not want to have competition from South Asia, right? The British textile mills want to churn out as much clothing as possible, and they don't want the artisans in South Asia making clothing, because then it's competition, right? If we have somebody in India wanting to buy a shirt, they can buy it from their own fellow South Asians who are making it in South Asia, or they can buy it from far off England. And so, right, the whole reason we're here in South Asia is to make a profit. And so what we'll do is England will flood India with cheap clothes, cheap imports, right? And that will put the artisans out of business. And so the artisans are going to lose business. And eventually we get to the point where India almost makes none of its own clothes. In fact, there are going to be laws passed that say they can't make their own clothes. And so now India is truly dependent economy. They have to depend on England to buy their raw cotton, and then they have to depend on England to sell them what really are kind of eventually will be overpriced because there's no competition, clothes from England. Right, so no industry in India at this point. We can't have artisans. We're certainly not going to let them open up factories owned by themselves. Now, England, interestingly enough, will open up factories in India to sell to the Indian market, but those are going to be owned by the English. So the wealth all goes back to England. All right, now we have an unintended consequence. As we increasingly control the economy of India, England is going to say to people who used to be South Asian, farmers who were self-sufficient, they're going to say, look, I don't want you growing food on your farm anymore. No, we're going to buy up your farm and we're going to force you to work on our tea plantation or our opium plantation or in some, emerald mine or whatever. And so we see less and less Indians are going to be growing food, which the British want, because now they're going to have to depend on England to get their food. Again, more dependent economy. And so this is going to cause food shortages in India, because the price of food is going to go up because it's going to become scarce, and they're going to have to all buy it from England. So, so whether you want to buy a shirt or food or whatever, now we can't use a barter system. We can't grow food for ourselves. We can't be self-sufficient. We're going to have to completely depend on England to get all of our stuff. And so farmers have to start, even if you do still own your farm in India and you're a South Asian farmer, you're going to have to stop growing food, because you have to buy everything now. You have to buy shirts and shoes and whatever. And so we're going to see South Asians, even if they do own their own farm, a small little farm, they're going to start growing their own tea. They're going to start growing opium. They're going to start growing cash crops. And so that's just going to make food production go down and down and down and down. Eventually, we're going to see huge famine sweep through India. Millions of people are going to starve to death. And it's all because of the British East India Tea Company's focus on profit, right? They're not thinking about how are the workers going to feed themselves. They're just thinking about how can we force workers to work for us, either on our plantations or to grow cash crops so they can buy our goods, right? And this is going to have this unintended consequence of famine. Now, we are going to see Indians leave India. If they're possible, we're going to see them migrate other places around the world to go looking for jobs. And so here we see it in this map, right? You find India on this map, and they have this orange color of people leaving. So if you had any money at all that you could afford transportation, you would get out looking for jobs other places. But if you didn't have any money, and you definitely don't want to stay in India, then what you do is you sell yourself into semi-slavery. And we've talked about this. It's called indentured servitude. And so we're going to see indentured servants from India go to South Africa at this time because we're going to have beef plantations opening up, or beef ranches, I guess, cattle ranches. And so we need sheep workers there. We're going to see indentured servants from India on all kinds of other plantations growing things, tobacco or whatever in South Africa, or employed as diamond or gold miners in South Africa under harsh working conditions. Even though it doesn't show it on this map, we're also going to see, and we've talked about, a whole bunch of South Asians as indentured servants make their way to the Caribbean. When slavery is outlawed in the Latin American revolutions, we're going to still need somebody to grow that sugar, and so we're going to see South Asian indentured servants come into the Caribbean to grow sugar there. And so, again, this big, wide trend of immigration happening at this time. And so, as time goes on, we get to about the mid part of the 19th century, and we're going to see things get really bad. Because of all the starvation and the workers being worked, horrible conditions for almost no pay, things are getting bad, and the people of India are getting very restless. The company's unceasing efforts to make a profit has really kind of left them blind about all the problems they're creating. And so we see that things kind of reach a fever pitch, right? Tension is building among the people of India, and that tension expresses itself in something called the Sepoy Mutiny. Now, if you remember, we had said Sepoys were South Asians that were working for the company, the British East India Tea Company, to oppress their fellow people and keep company rule going. Well, what happens when those Sepoy themselves get angry? And so what really set it off is, of course, they're angry because they see what's happening to their country and not exactly happy about being part of the problem, right? They're not exactly happy about their employees paying them to repress their fellow citizens. But what happens is there's a spark that sets it off. Is the British East India Tea Company, when they sell the cartridges that the gunpowder and the bullets are encased in, right? These paper cartridges, to keep them from getting wet, they greased it in animal fat, and that animal fat kept the paper that contains the gunpowder and the bullet dry. And you need dry gunpowder if you're going to put it in your weapon. And at that time, in order to put the gunpowder and the bullet in your gun, you had to, with your teeth, tear open the paper cartridge and then dump the bullet and the gunpowder in your gun. Well, okay, so that's what these sepoys did, and then they found out that it was animal grease that the British were using on the outside of these cartridges, and that made them just horribly upset because these sepoy are Hindus. And they are told that you cannot eat animal meat. They're vegetarians, a lot of them, and so they got really mad that, okay, not only are you making us repress our own country and we have mass starvation going in our country and horrible working conditions, but now you've tricked us into breaking one of our religious tenets. And so at that point, that was the spark that set the fire. And so we see that these armed people that the British East India Tea Company has armed turn against their employers and lead rebellions all across India. Now, eventually, the British government does put this down. They're forced to send their own government troops to put this down. But they said, look, it's the British East India Tea Company. You have made a botch of this, right? You have ruined India. This is very important for us as a country, not just you as a company, to be able to control India. and we're making lots of money off of it. And so they said, we're going to take over control of India away from the company. And so we switch from what's called indirect rule, where we see Britain is going to indirectly rule India through its company and its local rajas, to now more direct control, direct rule. And so now we see that the British government itself controls India, and it's not going to be controlled by the company anymore. Now, how does the British government then rule India? And so they kind of continue the British East India Tea Company's method of these local rajas being in charge. Because, again, we just don't have enough British to go out and send a British bureaucrat in charge of every village in India. It's just too many people in India. And so we see this is a continuity, right? Continuing to use local rajas to run provinces. But a change is going from company rule to government, the British government rule. So let's pretend you're a local Raja or you're a Maratha, you're one of these local rulers, and this is a pretty good deal for you, right? You get to be in charge of a province of India, a section of India. As long as you make sure that the people underneath you, the Indians, are working and they're buying goods and they're paying their taxes and they're keeping the British government happy, then you get to keep your elevated position. Even though you're a South Asian, you're in charge of these people, you're this Raja, and so you want to make sure that the British are happy with you. And so a problem was the language barrier. And so if you have a son, if you're one of these local elite and you have a son, you're gonna make sure he learns English so he can continue the family job of being this intermediary between the British government and the South Asian people. And so you're going to have your son learn English. You're going to have him adopt Western ways and a Western dress. And in many instances, you're even going to send him to fancy British schools, maybe even back in England, Oxford or Cambridge. And you're going to have him learn English, math, and science, and bureaucratic techniques, and the language and the culture. And so that the British will continue to use you and your family to run this province. Now, as this happens, there's an unintended consequence, is that a lot of these South Asian young men who go to England or to these Western universities to learn how to be a good bureaucrat, they also get, of course, exposed to the ideas of the Enlightenment. And then they come back to India and they see the hypocrisy, right? Back in England, we learn that the English say that all people are equal, that they have democracy, and they have freedom and liberty and freedom of speech and freedom of religion, these Enlightenment ideas. But when we come back to India, that does not apply to South Asians, and they are quick to point this out. And so we're going to be seeing the beginnings of a nationalist movement. And of course, nationalism itself started in Europe. And so these young people, we saw the same thing happen with the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire. These young people are going to bring these ideas back to India and start agitating for nationalist, Enlightenment, democratic reform. Who should be in charge of India? Indians should be in charge of India. And so that's what we see in this left-hand picture. By the way, if you don't know, this is a young Gandhi. He is going to be one of these young people who go and get Western educated and bring back these Western ideas of Enlightenment and nationalism back to India and ask for self-home rule. So let's talk about this resistance. Now, certainly, the Sepoy Mutiny is an example of violent resistance, but here is an example of more diplomatic resistance. And so because these South Asians were starting to say to the English, look, you're being hypocritical, you believe in the Enlightenment, but you're not letting us have it. And so they get England to agree to the creation of something called the Indian National Congress in 1885. And in the Indian National Congress, we're going to see these local elite people. They work with the British government to help inside India gain suffrage, not for all people, but certainly for men who have a certain amount of wealth, and be able to start to suggest. So this Indian National Congress is going to have the power, they're going to get elected, and they're going to have the power to suggest that laws will be passed to help the people of India. And the British government, knowing that they don't want a full-scale another rebellion, are going to listen. And to some extent, they're going to listen to this Congress, and they're going to try to address issues that are really making the people of India mad. They're going to try to, reintroduce food production to get rid of the starvation. And they're going to try to, on a small scale, because we don't want to compete with British businesses, to open up some Indian businesses that will allow them to raise themselves out of poverty. And so England is playing this tightrope, right? Walk. They don't want a rebellion, and so they're going to listen to the Indian National Congress on some issues and help raise the status, the living of some Indians, but not too much, because we still want India to be a dependent economy. We still want them to depend on us because it benefits England to get their raw materials and force them to buy our goods. And so it is some Enlightenment reform, but certainly not as much as it should have been. Now, internally, there's another problem, is that India is divided among two different large religious groups. They're all South Asian, but some of them, and we've talked about this in previous lectures, is that some of India is Hindu and some of India is Muslim. Primarily Muslims will be found in the north, and then Hindus are found all over the place, but there's going to be a larger concentration in the middle and south of South Asia. And so we're going to see that the Muslim people, who are in the millions, but they're still a minority, they're concerned that this Indian National Congress is dominated by Hindus, and they're not going to do anything to help the Muslim population of South Asia. And so they're going to form a political league called the Muslim League to try to make sure that as England sort of gives some Enlightenment rights to the people of India, that they don't forget the Muslims. And so this shows you this very important split in India between the Hindus and the Muslims. Now, in the 20th century, eventually India will get its independence from England in the 20th century after World War II. And this Hindu-Muslim split is eventually going to lead India to be split between India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. But that's another lecture and another time period. But we see it already beginning here. And so that's it for South Asia. When we come back, we'll do part 2, and it'll be Southeast Asia and other parts of the globe.